Major, what a service. What were some of your main takeaways from today's ceremony?
First of all, when we lay to rest and memorialize an American president, we're reminding ourselves of the process by which that person became president. A national campaign that transfixed the country, and the country made a decision to elect whomever it was to occupy the office of the presidency. And even if that, as in the case of Jimmy Carter's presidency, is riddled by political turmoil, external events that sometimes appeared overwhelming, and that president isn't reelected, upon their death, we reevaluate not only the life that they led before the presidency, during the presidency, and afterwards, but what that presidency meant in the moment to our country. And the reflections now on the Jimmy Carter presidency got quite a bit of notice in the eulogies today, saying, yes, there were external events, inflation, an oil embargo, a hostage crisis, but there are also accomplishments, things that maybe were not as well appreciated then, but live with us today. Jason Carter, the president's grandson, said he was an early millennial because he influenced policy dealing with technology, meaning he helped create the cable industry, which led to streaming services, which led to cell phones. He deregulated the airlines, which led to low-cost travel, which we all take for granted now. He created the modern shipping economy, where Amazon and everything else is basically built into our daily lives because he deregulated trains and trucking in our country. So those things live with us now because of Jimmy Carter's presidency. I guarantee you, having read the history of that presidency and being old enough to remember it in my high school years, got almost no notice at the time. Almost none, maybe a teeny bit. So when we reappraise presidents at times like this, we sort of go back and say, hey, what actually happened? And is there something we missed or something that we should think about slightly differently? That happened with George Herbert Walker Bush. It happened with Gerald Ford.
And it looks like we lost Major.
The false.
There he is. Go ahead, Major. I'm sorry. There was a technical glitch.
I'm sorry. The technical glitches, we are living with them ever constantly. There is a sense in the short-term analysis of President Carter, well, his post-presidency is the historic part. Those who were closest to him say, no, 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 not so fast. The presidency mattered. The president was tested. The president had lots of political ups and downs, more downs than ups, but it still mattered. And the fundamentals he brought to that office, honesty, I will never tell you a lie, integrity, not doing backroom deals, even with his own party, congressional Democrats, which got him a lot of hostility within his own party, putting aside an intra-party challenge from Ted Kennedy for the nomination in 1980. All things very difficult to balance, all things very difficult to juggle. He had a significant and relevant presidency. That's also been part of the conversation, not just today, but for the last 2 weeks.
So many poignant moments of the service today, Major. The eulogies, though, by both the late President Gerald Ford and Carter's Vice President Walter Mondale, bred by Ford's son, Stephen, and Mondale's son, really stuck out to me. And it really spoke to the friendship and love that these two men had for President Carter. What was your reaction to those tributes?
That Jimmy Carter had a fierceness to him about politics. You don't become governor of Georgia. You don't, upon becoming governor of Georgia in 1970, look at all the segregationists in your party and say the days of segregation are over, shock them, appall them, anger them instantaneously about taking the office. If you don't have a sense of courage, a sense of purpose, you don't pursue the presidency when no one knows your name and no one in the Democratic Party takes you seriously, win the nomination and win the presidency without that core set of fierceness and determination. Jimmy Carter had all that, but he also had a kind of friendliness and openness and curiosity about people that transcended politics, basically took away easy, reflexive partisan differences and endured. Gerald Ford's son spoke to that. Walter Mondale's son spoke to that. And many people who have known Carter, either as president or in his post-presidency, said that he was more genuine than even they would have expected, and more approachable, more relatable than they would have expected. Not a person of grandeur. He wasn't in the office of the presidency, and he wasn't after the presidency. And that's something that people found not only enticing, but enduring, and built long, sustaining bonds, which not everyone does in politics. I can tell you that for certain.
Yes, definitely. And Major, I want to lean into something you brought up earlier in this conversation, because so much of Carter's legacy really revolves around his life after he was in the White House. He left Washington with a low approval rating. But looking at our current political climate, do you think history will perhaps look at his legacy as president differently?
I think it will. It always takes time. It takes a long time. And look, Jimmy Carter, twice in his presidency, once in 1978 and again in 1980, had an approval rating of 26%. That's a terribly low number. So in the fierceness of the time in which he was president, the American people turned away from him. His presidency sometimes looked and felt very small, as if he was overwhelmed by events. There were articles written at the time about the ungovernability of America, and how difficult things like inflation and interest rates and an oil embargo and the hostage crisis just made everyone feel as if things simply could not be brought into any semblance of order. That all flowed toward the Carter presidency and was held against the Carter presidency very strongly. That doesn't mean, even though that was the public perception, widespread at the time, that it was nothing but one failure after another. The legislative accomplishments of the Carter presidency stand up pretty well. Yes, he had large majorities of Democrats in the Senate and the House. But remember, a lot of those were Southern Democrats who were not necessarily in every way comfortable with Jimmy Carter. They thought in some respects he was too progressive, too liberal, and didn't always align with him. So that was a difficulty. But as I mentioned before, when you look at deregulating the airlines, trucking, telecommunications, even craft beer, those are accomplishments. His foreign policy, people think about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and they think, well, Ronald Reagan must have helped defeat the Soviets. No, Jimmy Carter was the first one to authorize covert assistance to the Mujahideen, which led to the defeat of the Soviets in Afghanistan. Obviously, the Camp David peace accords, an enormous accomplishment that still is with us today. Egypt and Israel, every hour of every day, are trying to figure out a way to get the hostages out from Gaza and resolve that long-running war between Hamas and Israel because of the Camp David Accords and the durability of that peace pact between Israel and Egypt. President-elect Trump is talking about the Panama Canal. Highly controversial at the time, but Jimmy Carter thought it was enormously important for America to soften its Yankee imperialist image throughout South America and Central America, turn the Panama Canal over to Panamanian control eventually. That was a very hard-fought political battle. It proved to be one that he accomplished and won, though the politics were demonstrably against him. That has proved to be durable and is being revisited today, not because the Panamanians are not handling the canal well, it's because the Chinese have some interest in the ports on both ends of that canal. That's a legitimate international policy issue, but it's not the Panamanians' fault, and it is certainly not Jimmy Carter's fault for creating a treaty by which control of that canal would eventually be given over to Panama. All of those things were part of the Carter presidency. If there's one constant thread to that presidency, Jimmy Carter ignored the politics and pursued the policy. Even when his closest advisors, including his wife Rosalind, said, "Don't take this political risk now, save it for later," Jimmy Carter's response as president always was, "There might not be a later in which I can accomplish what I can accomplish now. I will do it now. Politics be damned." Well, he damned the politics. That came back to bite him, led to his defeat in 1980. But it didn't mean he didn't accomplish a lot in the policy area.
Jimmy Carter was a remarkable person, a remarkable president. He leaves quite the legacy. Major Garrett, thank you so much for taking the time with us, sir. Thank you so much for your insight.